Salutations and welcome, horse racing fans. I'm your host, Matthew DeSantis, and this is the Win Play Show, a podcast devoted to all aspects of horse racing and handicapping that is proudly part of the Amalfi Media Network. Now, I don't know about you, but in the days leading up to the Breeders' Cup, I love nothing more than going on YouTube and doing some deep dives and getting into some click holes and watching previous Breeders' Cup races as almost a ritual in order to get me ready for the big day at Del Mar coming up this weekend. Therefore, what I wanted to do today was share with you my top 10 Breeders' Cup moments since 2000, going over the last 20 years. Now, if you're watching on YouTube, we have links below in the description for all of the races, so you can watch those magical moments as well. If you're listening on the podcast, if you want to, head over to amalfimedia.com, where I have a blog in which I do a little write-up about each race, and I also include the embedded videos from YouTube in that blog, so you can read and watch and listen and watch, and you can have all of your senses overwhelmed by the Breeders' Cup. Now, before we get to the list, just a quick reminder to follow, download, rate, review, and share the Win Play Show on the podcast platform of your choice, and subscribe to the Win Play Show on YouTube with our YouTube channel. And if you're listening on the podcast, that link to YouTube is in the episode notes. Finally, we have a lot of great Breeders' Cup coverage. And so if you missed some of it, listen, there's still plenty of time. You can go back and watch my interview with NBC's Donna Barton Brothers, which aired on Monday. A lot of great stories she tells, a lot of great insight into the Breeders' Cup, some wonderful stories about D. Wayne Lucas, Todd Pletcher, Steve Asmussen, Mike Smith, and so many more. You can also go and check out my picks and previews episode for all 6 juvenile races, as well as a separate picks and previews episode for all 9 of the adult 3 and up races. You can find those on the podcast, on our YouTube channel, or on amalfimedia.com. Okay, now let's not waste any more time and dive into the top 10 Breeders' Cup moments since 2000. Now, when I put the list together, I tried to consider a lot of things. You have to consider the backdrop to the race, the participants, the connections, the finish, so much more. There are a lot of variables that make a great race. Sometimes it's a display of dominance. Think Secretariat at the Belmont. Other times it's an amazing duel. Think Affirmed and Alidar, and all those races they had against each other. While other times it's an upset. I can't tell you how many times I've watched the Mind That Bird 2009 Kentucky Derby victory, and more importantly, the Calvin Borel interview afterwards, which is always a lot of fun. Or it could be a battle of the sexes, such as Rachel Alexandra at the Preakness, where you also got some great Calvin Borel footage afterwards. But whatever the reason, some races just stick out as instant classics and are indelibly etched into our minds. So without any further ado, let's dive into my top 10 moments. And we'll start at 10 and count it down. And at number 10, we have the 2002 Breeders' Cup Classic. Now, that was a race that really featured one of the all-time great Breeders' Cup upsets in Volponi, pulling off the upset and doing it with style. What's so fascinating is when you go back and watch that 2002 Breeders' Cup Classic, it is chocked full of some really impressive horses. You're talking about War Emblem, who won the Kentucky Derby and the Preakness that year. You're looking at the European Super Horse Evening Attire, who looked great. You're talking about Medaglia d'Oro, who has turned into one of the most prodigious sires. So this was a really top-heavy field, and a field where if you were handicapping back then, certainly the top winners you would think would come out of those 3. However, it was Volponi, whose best finish to that point was winning the Grade 3 Pilgrim Stakes. Now, he did hit the board at the Travers, or at the Whitney, I should say, earlier that summer. So certainly showed that he could hang with grade one competition. But like I said, best finish was a grade three victory coming into that race. But he had a great trip. He sat in that stalking position around 4-5 the entire way around. And when he hit the stretch run, when he hit the top of the stretch, he just exploded and just pulled away from the field. I mean, it was a little bit like Mine That Bird, where the person, Tom Durkin, was calling the race, and it almost felt as if he couldn't believe that Volponi was doing this, that he was so much more focused on the other horses. And then suddenly it was Volponi that was just pulling out and pulling away and ended up winning the Breeders' Cup Classic by 6.5 lengths, which was a record. So for the largest margin of victory in that race. And Volponi, for those of you who like handicapping, went off at 44-1 odds, was the second biggest upset ever in the Breeders' Cup Classic to that point. And here's the really crazy part. Volponi never won another race. That said, after this, he did go on, amazingly, to finish second in 5 consecutive races, including several grade one races during his 2003 campaign. So he ended up having a very successful career after that, but never winning again. Just an amazing effort, and that's why it comes in at number 10 on my list. All right, well, let's move to number 9, and that is the 2011 Breeders' Cup Mile. And this is where Court Vision ends an era of dominance. Listen, sometimes races are classic because of the horses that don't win. And sometimes it is when that horse that you expect to be dominant, you expect to win, falls short. And another horse comes up and takes the mantle. And those can be very special moments. And that's exactly what took place at the 2011 Breeders' Cup, where Goldikova had won the previous 3 Breeders' Cup Mile races. I mean, unprecedented dominance in that division. 3 straight. And honestly, did it with ease. And this was a race that was really fascinating. Goldikova was really stuck inside for most of that race, almost alarmingly so. And she was kind of in that 4-5 slot. So a good position in terms of, not being forced on the lead and being able to sit behind the leaders, which is the style she preferred. But she was really pinned inside. And there were several horses really right around her, behind her, next to her. She was really pinned in there in that 5 slot. And it looked for a while like she was not going to be able to find an opening. But wouldn't you know it, at the top of the stretch, she's able to kind of gear outside a little bit, and she opens up that impressive stride she had. And you think, okay, this thing's over. We've seen this before. We've seen 3 consecutive years of this. This is what she does. And indeed, she pulls away from the pack. But out of nowhere, Tour Allure and Court Vision are kind of these blurs on the far outside and in the middle of the track. And they come running up from way behind, and they nab Goldikova. They pass her. It's a photo finish between the two of them. Court Vision ends up being the one who pulls it off, beating Tour Allure by a nose. And you just see that era of dominance. Everybody assumed this would be a coronation, 4 straight Breeders' Cup Miles for Goldikova. Ends up being Court Vision that wins at a 65-1 upset. And this would end up being her final race. So quite a way to go off. And that's why it comes in at number 9 on the list. All right, well, let's go to number 8, and that's the 2003 Breeders' Cup Turf. And this is one of those races that is defined because of the finish. It's not necessarily that these 2 horses, Johar and High Chapparal, were household names, but the finish they put on is just absolutely incredible. It is breathtaking, and it was a dead heat. That's right. They couldn't even tell the difference between these 2, and that's what made this so special. Because listen, and we've all seen those pictures at the finish line, and it just looks like a whiskers difference between the two. They couldn't even tell the difference between these two. And this took place at the 2003 Breeders' Cup. Like I said, it was the turf race at Santa Anita. Going into the stretch, it's interesting. It looked like Falbrov, who had won 4 Grade 1 victories in his 2003 campaign, would put this thing away because he starts to pull away. The stretch run sets up perfectly, and you think, okay, Falbrov has got this covered. And then all of a sudden, you see High Chapparal kind of come up and confront him and start gaining. And you think, okay, High Chapparal might just be able to pull this off. And it's important to point out, High Chapparal had a really nice 2002 campaign. But listen, you thought, okay, 2003 hadn't really been High Chapparal's year. You thought, okay, well, maybe this is, last year's dominant horse against this year's dominant horse. All right, we'll see. And then all of a sudden, you just see this streak of black coming out of the corner of your screen, and it's Johar coming up from the middle of the track from way back and just gaining every stretch. And ultimately, High Chapparal and Johar finish about a nose ahead of Falbrov, who ends up finishing as an incredibly close third place. But Johar, High Chapparal, dead heat. Cannot differentiate. They both end up sharing the Breeders' Cup Turf title. It's just an amazing finish to watch those horses, and how 3 horses ended up, kind of took 3 very different ways to get there and got there all at the same time. Truly an incredible finish. So with that, let's move to number 7 on the list, and this is the 2013 Breeders' Cup Turf Mile. And this is one of those races that, at least in my eyes, is defined by dominance. And again, we have Santa Anita as the backdrop. And Wise Dan puts on a display in the turf mile. And this is one of those where you have to understand the career of Wise Dan to really appreciate this finish and this race. Wise Dan's a horse that won 23 of his 31 career races. We talk about Latruska being dominant. We talk about Essential Quality being dominant. 23 of 31. Good Lord. Had won the Breeders' Cup the year before as well. The most impressive thing is, once they figured out that Wise Dan was a turf horse, not a dirt horse, he won 18 of his last 21 races. And just absolutely incredible. Now, this race, why is it so special? Couple of reasons. One, Wise Dan actually stumbles out of the gate a little bit, does not break particularly well, gets shuffled back a little bit, and the pace is absolutely bonkers. Larry Colmus is calling the race, and he's even exclaiming over the announcing how incredible the pace is. How incredible? 21-9 opening quarter of a mile. They're flying. You rarely see a 21 and change opening quarter in sprint races, let alone in a mile. Opening half in 44.5. Oh my God. When people talk about Nick Sko running a mile, and his opening half a mile is usually about 46 seconds, 46 and 2, 46 and 3. We're 44 and 5 opening half mile. Well, this ends up playing into Wise Dan's favor, because this blistering pace out front obviously cannot be sustained. And so those horses that are out ahead are going to start to fall back a little bit. Wise Dan's been behind, and again, kind of veers out middle of the track, hits that stretch run, and just will not be denied. He made up a ton of ground, passed all the horses, and really proved to be a champion of champions on that day. Picked up his 2nd consecutive Breeders' Cup championship as he put away Silentio and Za Approval. Just an absolutely incredible stretch run, and just one of those races that is electrifying because of the pace, because you just honestly can't believe the numbers you're seeing on the screen, and you can't believe the pace that these horses are keeping up. You're just so drawn to this race. And so many times you just think, will the favorite be able to kind of get out, get out in the open. And will Wisedan be able to finish his career in this kind of style? And to do it the way he did, just incredibly impressive. And one of those moments that I enjoy going back and revisiting quite regularly. All right, well, let's move to number 6 on the list. And this one, listen, this is a personal one for me. And this is the 2011 Breeders' Cup Turf. And with St. Nicholas Abbey winning. And this race to me is less about St. Nicholas Abbey, who's a very good horse. Was a very good horse. Died young, but was a very good horse. Had won the Coronation Cup, which was grade 1 competition. Won it actually 2 years in a row. Was a very accomplished horse. Finished third at the grade 1 King George VI Queen Elizabeth Stakes. But what made this race so special is the parental and fatherly connection in the race, where Aidan O'Brien, who is the trainer for St. Nicholas Abbey, and his son Joseph, who is the jockey for St. Nicholas Abbey. That's what makes it special. Horse racing is a family business. So many families in horse racing continue on. Whether it's the Asmussens, whether it's, you look at the jockey colonies in particular, Pinkays and people like that. So much of it is a family business. Even my host on Monday, or my interview guest on Monday, Donna Brothers, her mom was a jockey as well. It's a family business. And I think so many of us who love horse racing were introduced to the sport by our parents. And I know that's true for me. Both my mom and my dad had a deep love of horse racing. And they introduced it to me from an early age, watching things like the Derby and the Triple Crown, but then also taking me to the track and teaching me how to read a racing form. And there's a connection. And this year for the Breeders' Cup, I'm not going out to Del Mar. I'm not going to some OTB. I'm driving down to Greenville, South Carolina to watch it with my dad. That's what makes horse racing special for me. And the idea that Aidan O'Brien, this great now accomplished European trainer, gets this Breeders' Cup victory with his son Joseph aboard St. Nicholas Abbey just makes it an incredibly special moment, a heartfelt moment, and just one that, and again, this is 10 years ago now. Aidan O'Brien certainly had an impressive resume 10 years ago, but he was not the household name that he is today. He didn't necessarily have the dominant stable as he does today 10 years ago. And just really amazing to see. And what's also funny to see in that race is Joseph O'Brien is a lot taller than most other jockeys. And so just watching him on that horse, he just looks very cramped up. I mean, he's contorting his body in such a way because he's such a big guy. He's got these long legs. And you can just see he just looks different than all the other jockeys on St. Nicholas Abbey. But a great run from St. Nicholas Abbey, coming from that stalking position, coming around and putting on a stretch run and winning for Aidan. And Joseph is able to give Aidan that Breeders' Cup victory. Just a really, like I said, wonderful moment to watch. And that one is less about the race and more so about the celebration afterwards. If you watch it on YouTube, if you watch the embedded videos we have, if you watch the link below, as soon as the race is over, the camera cuts to Aidan O'Brien and his family, and it's just a very special moment. So that's why it's up there on the list for me. Maybe an unusual one that's not up there on other people's lists, but I always have it as a very high in my heart. All right, well, let's get into the top 5. And so at number 5, let's go to the 2016 Breeders' Cup Distaff and Beholder. Beholder finishing her career on top. This is a special, special moment. This is one of those moments where so oftentimes, I'm guilty of it as anyone, you anthropomorphize. You give human emotions and thoughts to animals, and you assume that they must feel and think the same things that we do, that they're aware of the same things that we are. And on a certain level, they can be. Horses are very perceptive animals. They perceive things like fear. If you're afraid and you walk up to a horse, the horse is going to know you're afraid. They're very perceptive animals. But this was Beholder's final race. And in some ways, we as consumers of the sport and watchers in some ways think that Beholder knew it was her last race. Of course, I doubt the horse realized it was her last race. Maybe there's things about horses we don't know. But this was an effort of a horse that just simply refused to lose her last race. She wanted to go out on top, and she did. And that's what made this race so special. 2016 Breeders' Cup. It's at Santa Anita again. And it's her last race. And like I said, she just refused to lose. And it's interesting, going into that race, it kind of looked like maybe Beholder had lost a step. She had been a dominant horse for so long and then had finished second the 3 straight races leading into Santa Anita. Now, lost to some very good horses, lost horses like California Chrome, lost to some excellent horses. But she turned for home in that Breeders' Cup Distaff, and she dug in against Songbird. Songbird was on the lead, and as Larry Colmus, gave the call in that race, he goes, and now Beholder confronts her, and it is a confrontation, and they come down the stretch, and to watch that stretch run is to watch 2 horses going stride for stride. I mean, they look like mirror images of each other. They are galloping exactly the same pace, exactly just nose to nose, head to head. They are going the entire stretch. Everybody else is behind them. Don't worry about that. It's a duel. It's just a 2-horse race at this point between Songbird and Beholder. And, it looks like about 100 meters out, you think Songbird's going to end up winning this. But over the last 3-4 strides, Beholder reminded everyone why she's a champion. And not just a champion, but a champion of champions. And she edged out Songbird at the wire. Larry Colmus is going nuts, calling the Beholder ends up winning the victory. But this is one of those moments where you love to see a horse go out on top. And that's what you got to see in the 2016 Breeders' Cup Distaff with Beholder. Now let's move to a little bit of the inverse of that. And that's the 2010 Breeders' Cup Classic between Blame and Zenyatta. And this was Zenyatta's final race. And, horse racing is one of the few sports where we occasionally get to see the boys go up against the girls. You get to see a battle of the sexes on an even playing field, both of them going against each other at the height of their powers. And that's exactly how things played out in 2010 at Churchill Downs as the super filly Zenyatta, who had never lost a race to this point, undefeated, goes up against Blame, who had won 8 of his 12 career starts at that point, had never finished off the board. And the race played out with a lot of drama. Zenyatta breaks poorly from the starting gate, lags behind the field. Mike Smith is trying to get her up. He's trying to hustle, and you could tell she's out of sorts. And he's trying to get her up. She's still dead last and about 10 plus lengths off the pace for the majority of the race. However, when Zenyatta kicks, man alive, watch out. And, it looked like Mike Smith was going to go on the inside, and that's always a dicey proposition. And going into that 4th turn, he kind of takes her inside, and then at the last second, you just see this hole open up, and he just takes her diagonally and pulls her out to the middle of the track. And it's a brilliant piece of riding by Mike Smith, who I know now people, think maybe his best days are past him, but you're reminded about what a great jockey he was at one point, because he just pulls her out and gets her going, and she makes this furious stretch run. And Blame's in the lead this whole time. Blame's kind of one of those 2 horses that are kind of in the lead stalking position. And so Blame is now pulling away from the horse that had been in the lead. He's now trying to hold on. He's digging in. Zenyatta's coming with just an incredible rush that lasts probably 300 meters and is just gaining with every single stride and coming up the middle of the track. And you think, oh my God, does she have enough? Is she going to be able to do it? And at the end of the day, Blame holds on to wins by a nose. And you could almost hear the disappointment in Trevor Denman's voice who was calling the race when he realizes that blame ultimately edged her out. And the race ended up being the final race of Zenyatta's career and the only blemish on an otherwise perfect career. But just an incredible run from her, an incredible finish from Blame. And like I said, sometimes races are memorable, not so much for who wins, but who loses. And that's an example of that. Well, let's move to number 3. We're getting into some of the best right now. And this is one I mentioned earlier. Sometimes it's about dominance. It's not necessarily about how good the race is. It's about showing the dominance of a horse. And this is the aforementioned Goldikova running in the 2010 Breeders' Cup Mile and making it a historic 3 in a row. Now, like I said, we talked about her falling short the next year, but in 2010 at Churchill Downs, she made history, becoming the first horse to win the same Breeders' Cup race 3 times. Absolutely incredible feat. And here's the part, and here's why it's so high up on my list, because I think other people might say, well, why is this so far up? Why is this number 3? Part of the reason is she made it look easy. It just didn't even look difficult. That's what's so impressive about this, is you're pulling off something for the 3rd year in a row. And for each of those years, she just kind of dispatched her competition in a way that you thought she was running in an allowance race or some sort of, maiden special weight. She simply outclassed everybody else in the field. And then you realize everybody else in the field was a champion. These were not horses they just found on the backstretch. These were champion horses. And when she kicked for home and she puts on that stretch run, it's over. I mean, it's over. When you see the jockey start hand riding her and pushing down on her neck, forget about it. And she just comes storming for home. And like I said, dominance may not always be thrilling to you. However, I always marvel at how the great athletes show their greatness at those great moments. It's about big time players making big time plays in big time games. You've heard football players talk about that all the time. I love watching great horses put on great performances in great races. And that's exactly what Goldikova did at the 2010 Breeders' Cup Mile. And that's why she's number 3 on my list. Now, let's move to 2. And you probably know, if you're a horse racing fan, you probably know where my top 2 are. And now it's just a matter of which one do you like number 1, which one do you like number 2. I'm not sure there's a right answer to this. And number 2, I have the 2001 Breeders' Cup Classic, where Tiznow wins it for America. This race it sends chills down my spine when I watch it over and over again, because you have to remember the backdrop that the race is taking place in. It's November 2001. The September 11th attacks had taken place 2 years earlier, or 2 months earlier, I should say. And part of the way the country had healed after that was through sports. In baseball, we saw the Subway World Series between the Yankees and the Mets. And very memorably, then President Bush came out through the first pitch right down the pipe for a strike at a moment that I think all Americans remember. You just had this reverberation of American fervor and patriotism, but not in a negative way. It was just being proud of being an American, reminding ourselves why we're such a special country, why we love this country so much. And so here we are at Belmont in 2001, just right up the road from where the terror attacks had taken place. And the Breeders' Cup Classic is now the backdrop to this international competition between the American Horse of the Year, Tiznow, who has gone on to be a prodigious sire, against one of the top European horses who had won the ARC that year, Sakhi. And watching that race is so interesting because Sakhi and Tiznow, very different body types. I mean, you can tell Sakhi is very sleek, very slender. Tiznow is this big, bulky horse. And you can tell kind of an American versus a European type of horse, or just an American against a European to some extent. And so throughout the race, the two of them sat in perfect stalking position. They were just right off the leader of Albert the Great, and you're just thinking this is going to be the match. You're going to see the best in Europe against the best in the United States. Who's going to win? And Saki makes the first move and really puts on a nice kick and pulls away from Albert the Great and starts to pull out a little bit from Tiznow. And then all of a sudden, Tiznow just kicks in and digs in and just starts to slowly but surely make up on Saki. But listen, you still think probably 200 yards out, you still think Saki's got this thing. And then Tiznow just kept coming. Just picked up a couple inches every single stride. And as it came to the wire, Tiznow gets the head down in front. And while Saki makes a late lunge, just not quite enough. And here's what makes the race. Because sometimes the races in a vacuum are great. And this one's an example of that. You could watch this race on mute with no volume, and it's going to be amazing every single time. But what makes the race is Tom Durkin's call. As they're coming down and as they cross the wire, Tom Durkin screams out, "Tiznow wins it for America." And you just hear the roar of the Belmont crowd, and the people are going nuts. And it just, I start to well up a little bit thinking back to that because I was in college. The September 11th attacks happened the first day of my classes, my senior year in college. I mean, it's one of those moments that takes you back in time. It transports you. It just are instantly put back in that mindset. And the performance that Tiznow puts on is just classic and just a very, very special race. And that's why it comes in at number 2 on my top 10 list. Well, without any further ado, we have to get to number 1. And so drum roll, please. Brrr. The number 1 race of the last 20 years for the Breeders' Cup is simply the 2009 Breeders' Cup Classic and Zenyatta being unbelievable, to quote Trevor Denman. And that is the number 1 race in my eyes, and number 1 moment in my eyes of the last 20 years. And listen, maybe I'm basic. People always talk about basic bro. Maybe I'm basic for having this as my number 1 race. And maybe I could find some obscure sprint race from, 2006. Actually, I don't think there were any good sprint races in 2006. I went back and watched a lot of these old races to remind myself of all of them. Not just these in the top 10 list. I watched probably 100 of these things, everything I could find on YouTube. But listen, this is everything you could want in a race. And everything I said earlier about Zenyatta holds true. This is the race that came the year before, and this is a race I have rewatched hundreds of times over the last several years. The 2009 Breeders' Cup Classic is an instant classic for so many reasons. First, you get the battle of the sexes. Zenyatta's going against the boys, going against the best. Let's see what you got. Then you have the early adversity. Zenyatta, again, just like the next year, breaks poorly and is pretty far back. The only reason she's not last is because of Mind That Bird. Mind That Bird, who typically runs about 3 furlongs behind everyone until the very end, is dead last. But she's right there with Mind That Bird, which is never a good position to be in usually. So she's really far off the pace. Mike Smith is trying everything he can do, and you can tell she's out of her sorts. And that's the thing is, the next year when she broke poorly, she didn't look so confused. Mike Smith was trying to hustle her up a little bit, but it didn't look out of sorts. She really looked out of sorts for a while in that race. And you could tell Mike is kind of fighting with her a little bit. And finally, on the back stretch, she starts to settle down and starts to kind of get into and just loping along and is starting to just kind of get into her groove and get into her gallop. And she's not fighting him anymore, and they're going along. And they enter the last turn. And Trevor Denman, who's calling the race, it basically thinks she's dead in the water. And is just saying, if she pulls this off, it would be just a miracle. And next thing you know, the field starts to bunch up going into that 4th turn. Mike Smith is able to angle her out. And you think he's going to angle her out to kind of like the 4-5 slot on the track. And he pulls her all the way out to like three-quarters of the way to the grandstand. I mean, she's really far out in the middle of the track. And all of a sudden, she just goes and just unleashes her speed on the field. And the leaders are all kind of bunched up. And Gio is kind of the leader of that group. And she just goes, and people are losing their minds. And Trevor Denman's call, again, the calls sometimes was what makes these races. And he just goes, "This is unbelievable," as she crosses the finish line, a full length ahead of Gio. I mean, it wasn't even by a head or a neck, full length ahead of Gio. And it was just an instant classic. And to see her put on that show for the crowd, just absolutely amazing. Breathtaking, spine tingling, just one of those performances that you just never forget. Well, folks, that's my list. And I'll be honest, after talking about it, I'm nearly as breathless as Trevor Denman or Tom Durkin or Larry Colmus after these races. Just thinking about and talking about them makes me want to run all the way to Del Mar for Friday and Saturday's Breeders' Cup. I'll be honest with you. But listen, that will do it for today. But just a quick reminder to follow the Win Play Show on the podcast platform of your choice, subscribe to the Win Play Show on YouTube, or head over to amalfimedia.com to get all the horse racing coverage you need as we move on from the Breeders' Cup and get ready for the 2022 campaign. And if this is your first time listening, the Win Play Show does a lot more than just these sort of top 10s. We have weekly race previews, interviews with prominent figures throughout the horse racing industry, and so much more. Well, listen, friends, until next time, I'm Matthew DeSantis, wishing you a wonderful Breeders' Cup weekend, a great and prosperous day at the races, and reminding you that it's now post time.